Hey, it's Ed. Before we get started, I have two quick announcements. Number one, I want to thank some brand new podcast supporters: Jordan Cohen, Amber Brusack, Danielle Davis, David Braun, Tammy Wetzel, and Alex Fisher. These 6 people signed up to support the podcast via Patreon, which is monthly support. And if you want to learn more how that works, you can go to mountainandprairie.com/support. And the second thing, this episode is brought to you in partnership with my good friends at Explore Ranches. Founded in 2018, Explore Ranches was born out of a desire to share some of the most wild and scenic places in the U.S. and abroad with others. Explore Ranches is a private lands experiential travel company that offers awe-inspiring outdoor experiences and access to authentic ranch homes on some of the world's most expansive, historic, and picturesque ranches. In return for enabling access to these natural treasures, Explore Ranches is making new connections between ranch guests and landowners. In the process, landowners and guests are contributing to a network of open space that not only benefits wildlife, but the very food we eat, water we drink, and the air we breathe. Whether you're an Explore Ranches guest, a ranch partner, or one of the Explore Ranches guides, Explore Ranches is on an endless journey to help you find your place in the wild. I've personally known 2 of the 3 co-founders of Explore Ranches since 1993, and I consider them to be longtime good friends. I've been enormously impressed by this business and their entire team's commitment to conservation and responsible land stewardship. They've created a unique win-win opportunity for people like me who are not landowners, but would love the opportunity to explore private land, as well as for landowners who are looking to diversify their ranch's revenue streams. I give Explore Ranches my full endorsement, and I encourage you to check them out. So if you're a landowner looking to unlock the recreational potential of your property, or a traveler interested in an unforgettable experience in a wild and scenic place, go to exploreranches.com to learn more. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Dave Hewitt. Dave is the executive director of the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute, an organization that's widely recognized as being the leading wildlife research organization in Texas. The institute is located on the campus of Texas A&M Kingsville, and its mission is to provide science-based information for enhancing the conservation and management of Texas wildlife. Dave and his team at the institute are focused on applied science, research and science that's useful, actionable, and tightly focused on helping land managers meet their goals. Dave was born and raised in Colorado and followed in his grandfather's footsteps to become a wildlife biologist. After earning his undergraduate degree from Colorado State, his education and research took him to many different corners of the United States, but in 1996 he landed at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute. For the past 25 years, Dave has been fully focused on the flora and fauna of Texas, and many of his projects have had positive ripple effects on land management throughout the American West and beyond. Whether discussing the management of ocelot, restoration of native grasslands, or the history of the Institute, Dave's enthusiasm for the natural world is palpable and inspiring. Dave and I connected and had a fun discussion about the Institute's past, present, and future, as well as his fascinating career path. We started out talking about the Institute's namesake, Caesar Kleberg, and why Caesar is known as the father of Texas wildlife conservation. We then discussed why the huge proportion of private land in Texas makes the state so unique from a land and wildlife management perspective. We also dug into several of the Institute's success stories, including its work with ocelots and native grasses throughout the state. Then we dug into Dave's personal background, his impressive educational journey, his love of teaching, and his vision for the future of the Institute. If you enjoy learning about wildlife, native plants, and the people who've devoted their lives to protecting them, then you'll love this episode with Dave. There's a ton of fascinating information in this conversation, so be sure to check out the episode notes for links to everything we discuss. Hope you enjoy. I was thinking maybe the easiest way to kind of get into this conversation is if you could talk a little bit about Caesar Kleberg and who he was, because in my research before this conversation, he sounds like a larger-than-life figure that has had an impact beyond what you would imagine one person could have on Texas. All good stuff. So could you talk a little bit about Caesar Kleberg and his kind of history?
You bet. Yeah, and South Texas is full of characters, and Caesar Kleberg is definitely one of them. So Caesar was born in 1873 in Cuero, which is just north of where I am here in Kingsville, and grew up at a time when a lot of the kind of wildlife conservation wasn't really a thing. We're talking about decimation of the bison and passenger pigeons going extinct and market hunting and all that kind of stuff. So from a wildlife standpoint, I think that's part of the situation he grew up in. And grew up in a bit of a rural environment and developed a love for ranching and cattle and horses and hunting and bird dogs and all that kind of stuff that you expect someone in a rural environment in the late 1800s to develop passion for.
Yeah.
Went to college up in Austin after a year, really after a semester, figured out that wasn't where his future lay, and said that he wanted wide open spaces, and that's where he wanted to spend his life. So he came home after that, and then he went to work for his father, who was a congressman, right in the late 1800s, and actually spent some time in D.C. and I think got a sense of how the political world works and how to get some things done in that world. Made a lot of contacts, and then right at the very end of the 19th century, he came back and went to work at a bank in Corpus Christi. Mm-hmm. And in 1900, his uncle, Robert Kleberg, invited him to come work on the King Ranch. And so that's what really kind of got Caesar in a place where he could really have an influence. And so in 1900, he came to work on the King Ranch and then spent the rest of his life until 1946 working for the King Ranch here in South Texas. And what he was able to do in that position is working on this large ranch in South Texas. Was able to see both the problems wildlife was having and understand the potential for conservation that private landowners and really anybody managing land can have. And so as he was taking care of the cattle and the horse program and everything else on King Ranch, he also did some things to help promote the wildlife population on King Ranch. And this was before there was a Texas Parks and Wildlife or any state agency that was responsible for conservation. And so Caesar, working with the King Ranch family, put into effect some just kind of common sense hunting regulations. No hunting deer during the rut, not hunting around water holes, that wildlife need to survive, and just like I said, kind of common sense things like that. No shooting quail coveys on the flush. You had to go after singles, which help reduce the harvest and things like that. So that was just kind of an early indication that conservation and wildlife mattered to him, and he was willing to act to make some things happen, locally. And then he and the King Ranch worked with the state legislature to put aside about 400,000 acres of the ranch from kind of a preserve type standpoint. In other words, there was no hunting on that 400,000 acres for 10 or more years. And what that did is it allowed populations of game animals, particularly deer and turkey, to really build up. Mm-hmm. And then the King Ranch, through Caesar, got real active in reintroducing whitetail deer and turkeys across Texas and across the Southeast, because those species have been brought to really low levels, not quite, endangered species levels, but really low levels through market hunting and habitat changes and all the kind of stuff that was happening in the early 1900s. So there's a big conservation impact there. Caesar also got involved in the formation of what was at the time the Texas Wildlife, Fish, and Oyster Commission, which then became the state agency, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, that manages wildlife in the state. So Caesar was one of the first commissioners in that agency, and helped set the tone for conservation and actions of that agency. Worked with his cousin, Richard Kleberg, who was at that point, in the 1930s, congressional representative from South Texas in Washington, D.C., and worked with Richard Kleberg to establish the Duck Stamp Act, which has resulted in about $800 million of support for wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Yeah.
Just a tremendous conservation impact. And then kind of coming up toward the end of Caesar's life, he never married. And so he took his estate and in his will, he used his assets to establish a foundation for wildlife conservation, which back in the 1940s, was a rare act. That still wasn't on people's mind, like the 1970s or now, where there's a lot of people interested in supporting conservation. So Caesar did that, established the Caesar Kleberg Foundation for Wildlife Conservation in 1946 when he passed. And that conservation, or that foundation, has supported wildlife conservation since that time. It did a lot at different universities around Texas, and there's faculty members in Caesar Kleberg chairs at Texas A&M and at Texas Tech. Those people have done a lot of good work over the years. But I think the trustees of the Caesar Kleberg Foundation decided they wanted to try to have a bigger impact. They wanted to focus their efforts. And so in 1981, they came to the dean of the College of Agriculture at Texas A&I, which is what the university at that time was known as here in Kingsville, and asked him, Charlie DeYoung, who was the dean at the time, to come in on Monday morning. This was a Friday afternoon. Said, come in on Monday morning with a proposal for a wildlife research institute. And so Charlie DeYoung spent the weekend and wrote up a proposal and turned it in on Monday. And in 1981, the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute was established from that proposal. And so, that was kind of the long reach of Caesar's legacy, kind of direct actions. I think there's some indirect actions that, maybe a little harder to appreciate right off, but landowners in South Texas have a strong passion for wildlife and conservation and using their own resources to do the right thing for wildlife. And I think that really got started with Caesar Kleberg and his foresight and the importance of wildlife, to us as people here in Texas and really around the country. And for the economy and balancing the book on ranch and ranch accounts and things like that. So that's very much the case now. Wildlife's a huge part of the economy and the income that comes into ranches and everything. So it's just a lot of foresight, I think, is where Caesar's legacy really is making a huge difference.
That's great, and I mean, if there hasn't already been a book written about him, there should be, because I mean that is quite a legacy. Because everything you described that he was advocating for is pretty normal now. But I would imagine back when he was, kind of going out with these ideas, and you're dealing with people who'd kind of been able to do whatever they want to do and just wiping out wildlife. I would imagine it created a little bit of friction, and that may be an understatement. So I mean I think it speaks to his vision, but it also speaks to just being a real tough guy who's motivated by these values, and he believed in it fully, because that could not have been an easy fight to
exactly right.
Establish that. Just for some context, I talk to people. I've had a lot of folks from Texas, but I feel like for the last year or so, for some reason, I've been heavily focused on like Montana and Colorado, where public land is such a huge part, and wildlife. A lot of wildlife management goes to government entities. So can you just give us an overview or a thumbnail sketch of Texas and its private land and how it differs from your home state of Colorado?
You bet. Yeah. And that contrast to me makes it really interesting, because I did grow up in Colorado and grew up with the model of, the federal government owning the land and the state wildlife agency managing the wildlife, and then we go out and enjoy it as citizens. But it's very different here in Texas, and in some ways it provides a whole nother level of enjoyment and fulfillment of interacting with wildlife, because the landowner becomes an active participant in that stewardship, in managing those wildlife populations on their property. And there's all kinds of different motivations, maybe hunting, maybe bird watching, maybe, just a strong interest in native habitat and the wildlife that's there. So a lot of different interests, but because Texas is such a high percentage here, different percentages from 95 to 98% private land, conservation happens in Texas because of the private landowner and their passion for wildlife. And they really do. I find it remarkable how much effort and resources and, just kind of focus goes into wildlife management from private landowners here in South Texas. And so it's really neat, and it's a year-long interaction with wildlife. Like I said, it just provides a whole nother level beyond what most people do, to get out and hunt in the fall or bird watch in the spring or take pictures of wildlife, at different times. But that kind of stewardship aspect, I think, is a really neat addition to the way that we can interact with wildlife and have a stronger stake in its, in how well it's doing.
Yeah, my day job is in land conservation, private land conservation, and I feel like, at least up here in the Rockies, public lands gets so much press, as it should. I mean, and it's the focus of a lot of people because everybody can go out and enjoy it. But I'm always thinking that private lands needs to be in the spotlight a little more. But you guys in Texas, I mean, there's no other choice. So I really admire everything y'all do. Can you talk about the type of science that y'all do at the Wildlife Research Institute? Because there's a great video that I'll put on the webpage, and I'll link to in the notes so people can watch it. But it features you, and it features Caesar Kleberg, and he has a great quote in there where he says, "There's nothing theoretical about what we're doing here," which I love that, because it's just this. It's practical science, it's science that can be applied versus, just sitting around coming up with theories that may or may not go anywhere. So can you just kind of give an overview of what y'all do, and then we can dig into some of the specific projects?
You bet. And yeah, Teos just sums it up wonderfully in that video, but that's always been the focus of the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute, is to do what we call applied science. It's science that managers, landowners, anybody who's interested can take and use to help meet their goals for wildlife management. And it doesn't mean that, that we're not doing, even have maybe a theoretical base in some of it, but it's always with the end game of coming up with information and knowledge that can help managers meet their goals. And so, yeah, that's definitely the focus. And our funding model keeps us focused on that, because we get a lot of our funding from, private landowners, from state agencies, from the USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Forest Service. In other words, they're very applied type sources of funding. And so that keeps us focused on the questions that the managers have. And because we're meeting their needs, they've been wonderful about supporting the work that we do. So it's a great model to make sure that we've got the resources to do that important work, because we're focusing on the questions and the needs of the people that are going to be able to fund it.
So you've been there since 96. So our mutual friend, Jay Kleberg, and I graduated from high school together in 96. So I know it's exactly 25 years, because we were supposed to have our reunion. And so I want to talk about some current projects, but when you think back to your tenure there and everything you've done, I mean, what are some big victories that you're really proud of that the Institute has helped accomplish during the past 2.5 decades?
Yeah. So there's a variety of things, and some of them are unique because of the Caesar Kleberg's position and trust of private landowners. There's one really interesting project that I wasn't intimately involved in, but I think it kind of shows, how you can make a big difference. There's a species of owl here called the pygmy owl, that there's some concern, Ferruginous pygmy owl, I guess is its full name, and there's some concern about its population levels, and even talk about making it, declaring it an endangered species because there just didn't seem like there were very many of them. Mm-hmm. Well, the reason nobody knew about many of them is because they were all on private land, and there just hadn't been a lot of survey work done or anything. And so when that became an issue, the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute got involved, and with our private land partners, we were able to do some surveys and were able to demonstrate that no, there's plenty of these owls. We don't need to turn a whole bunch of federal resources on this species. Just that there just wasn't much known about them, but it didn't mean they weren't there. So that was one kind of smaller example of a project that really made a difference for conservation of the species and for the people that had that species on their property. Had a big research program over the years to try to understand these wildlife populations in this highly variable environment. When it rains in South Texas, this is as good a wildlife habitat as anywhere in the country. Mm-hmm. When it doesn't rain, we're on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert. And it can look like it. And so it makes for a really interesting situation in managing wildlife, particularly the hunted species, deer and quail, turkeys, those kind of species. And it's this high variability here matters not only to the local wildlife, but to wildlife across the continent, because we have birds, that migrate through here, wintering waterfowl. So understanding this highly variable environment can be really important. And over the last 40 years of the Institute, and certainly over the last 25 years since I've been here, a number of different research projects have tried to understand how to manage these different wildlife populations in this highly variable environment. And in doing so, we've been able to provide information to the people on the ground that are really trying to do that. And so that's been real unique and valuable, and has not only been applied type research, but I think has also contributed to our kind of broader ecological understanding of how wildlife exists in these highly variable environments. And so there's implications for way beyond South Texas out of that kind of work.
I love that kind of work that has applications beyond the region that you're, that is focused on. I mean, I think that's where the real power comes in. But one, that's obviously a really interesting project. But the thing that struck me is that you said, first of all, you said that you guys have the trust of the landowner community there. And I feel like all of the work you're doing, none of it would be possible without trust. I mean, at least here up in the kind of central northern Rockies, private land is everything. And there's a lot of suspicion that goes around with anybody, whoever you are, trying to get on private land. Even, with my conservation work, we have to show up once a year to monitor our easements. Mm-hmm. And that can, with certain landowners, that can create a little bit of, friction here and there just because of people really value private land rights. And so how have you guys gone about building that trust? Because that's the kind of thing, it's kind of an intangible, but it's really, I would guess it's the foundation of everything you do. And I would guess that there's probably a lot of pressure to, you've been building it for 40 years, but it could possibly disappear and pretty quickly. So
it could go away. Yeah. One bad experience, and somebody not treating the land or the people right. You're right. You could lose that trust in a heartbeat. And, so we actively work with our graduate students here, and when new faculty come in and make sure they understand, the critical work that these private landowners are doing, and the respect that we need to have in interacting with them. And the easiest way for me to think about it is it's like going on somebody's ranch to do some work is like being invited into their living room. Mm-hmm. And so when you go into someone's living room, you don't immediately start going and taking things off the shelf and leaving doors open and mm-hmm. all that kind of stuff. There's a respect that comes from being invited into somebody's house and from being invited onto their ranch to do work. And really, if you go at it with that mindset, I think that helps establish that trust. Kind of starts with respect, and the trust can flow from that. And then, doing work that matters to them, I think that also helps build that trust, because, we're not only in the position to benefit by generating, research and training students and do all that, but but there's a flow back to the private landowners with this information that we're providing them to help them meet their goals. And so, we're all working toward the same end. And I think that helps on the trust side as well.
I think obviously your science is impressive, but I think having this really deep well of trust with such a wide variety of landowners is hard to quantify, but that's everything. And so I'm very, very impressed by that. Can you, we talked about this briefly when we chatted on the phone, and I want to learn more about it, your Ocelot program and what you've been doing with that, because that seems like a really interesting project that is, you're working on every day now. Can you, first of all, for people up here in Colorado or Montana who may not know what an ocelot is, explain that cool looking animal and then tell me what y'all are doing with it.
You bet. Yeah, no, they're a real treasure. What an ocelot is, it's a small cat, so kind of bobcat size, 20 to 30 pounds. And their range extends from, South America, so the tropics down in South America up through Central America, and gets into the United States. Back in, let's say the 1800s, there were ocelots throughout, the coastal area of Texas, up into East Texas and into Louisiana, a little bit into Arkansas.
Oh, wow.
So that was their range, back in the late 1800s. And every once in a while they'll show up in Arizona as well, just right near the border with Mexico in southern Arizona. Largely because of unregulated trapping and hunting and habitat changes as well. The ocelots in Texas and the U.S. Essentially disappeared. And what they are, they're a spotted cat, so they're beautiful, absolutely spectacular, pattern, gold and yellows and black spotting on them, kind of like a leopard a little bit. And so there was interest in them from a trapping standpoint back in the day. And in the early 1980s, there was a graduate student named Mike Tuis who wanted to work on ocelots. He'd grown up in Odom, Texas, north of Corpus Christi just a little bit. And, and he thought, man, if there's still ocelots around, that would be super cool for South Texas and Texas as a whole, and really the United States, to have this beautiful cat and still have it in the U.S. But people were telling him, no, they're gone. Nobody's really seen an ocelot in years. And this was in the days before, all the remote cameras and all that kind of stuff. But Mike Tuis, as part of his PhD work, wanted to study ocelots. And so he got some funding and got all the pieces put together and started trapping right down, close to the Rio Grande River and the Gulf of Mexico, kind of down in that real southern tip of Texas. And he actually caught ocelots.
Wow.
So he was able to document that, no, Texas still does have ocelots. And there's a wildlife refuge down there, Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge, that has ocelots. That's where Mike had done some of his early work, and also on a couple of private ranches that the landowners were open their gates to him. And so over the last 40 years, since the early 80s, Mike Tuis has continued to study ocelots. And you can imagine in a state that's almost entirely private land, you talk about knocking on a door to see if they would let you trap for an endangered species, because ocelots are listed as an endangered species here in the United States. That's almost a non-starter.
Sure. And
there's a lot of landowners that are still really nervous about having anybody looking for or documenting the ocelots on their property. So it's still a touchy situation. But what's been really exciting over the last, I'm going to say 5 to 10 years, is a couple of private landowners have really stepped out and said, hey, ocelots are important, to us here in South Texas. They're important to the whole state and really to the nation, as a really unique species and something that people that know about them care a lot about. And so there's one ranch, the Uteria Ranch, that's down by Raymondville, Texas, and that was one of the early places that Mike Tuis trapped on. And Frank Uteria, the owner, who has since passed away, was just proud as could be of the ocelots on his property, and has areas set aside, even in conservation easement type set aside, to support ocelots. And and has not only worked with us, but the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy to make sure that ocelots can be conserved there. And then the other private landowner that really stepped out strong and is making a huge difference now is the East Foundation.
Uh-huh.
And so the East Foundation is a agriculture research organization, is what they're called. And it was established when Robert East passed away, and he put all his funding and property, including about 200,000 acres, into this foundation for ranching and wildlife conservation. And so Mike Tuis has been working with the East Foundation to study the ocelots on their property here in South Texas, that kind of on the southern tip. And the East Foundation has just some real enlightened, energetic leadership in Neil Wilkins, who is the CEO. And Neil has established some strong working relationships with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other landowners, and there's just a real groundswell of support for ocelot conservation now. And a lot of people that in the past may have had a hard time working together are coming together, and it's just really exciting to see this and talk about establishing other populations out in new areas that wouldn't be susceptible if they got hit with a hurricane, for example, or if disease found its way into one of these small isolated ocelot populations. There's evidence of genetic problems, at least loss of genetic diversity in these ocelots. And so bringing some new genetics in could be really valuable. And we've got, some colleagues from the University of Tennessee that know a lot about using called, assisted reproduction. In other words, you could use some artificial insemination to get some new genetic material into some of the females that are living in those areas and not even have to necessarily move cats around. So just a lot of exciting things going on. And it's just been really fun to see the passion and enthusiasm come together to help this really unique animal recover.
Can you believe this is your job? Like, this is what you get to do for your job?
They get up every day and do this. And you can't imagine anything better to help support these kind of efforts and work with people with this kind of passion and everything. It's incredible. One
question I have really for my own education, because I should pay closer attention to this stuff and I don't. With the Endangered Species Act, you mentioned that landowners get real nervous about that. And I read all this stuff and there's way too much information online and everybody's got extremely strong opinions on one side or the other. And what are from your position as a scientist, as a researcher, as a wildlife advocate, as somebody who works with private landowners, can you just give me a rundown of kind of the pros and cons in your mind of the Endangered Species Act? Because I can't get to the bottom of the story because everybody's so hyped up about it. And if you don't want to wade into it, I'll cut this out. So
Right. Okay. Yeah. I'll take a shot at it. And you're right. It's controversial. So trying to maintain our wildlife diversity has value, and it has value in economic ways and, and just our kind of quality of life and everything. So the goal of the Endangered Species Act, I think is good and noble. Where things get difficult is, there's a bit of a hammer in the Endangered Species Act with any federal activity that could cause a species to go extinct, needs to be reviewed and approved or denied if it really is gonna cause the extinction of a species. And so that's where I think a lot of the rub happens with private landowners. And it's not a lack of interest in conserving species. It's more kind of losing options for the future.
Sure.
Because you've done a good job and have an endangered species on your property.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Everybody we work with, down in that part of Texas where ocelots could potentially be found, would be super proud to have ocelots and even to let other people know that they have ocelots if they do. But they don't want to lose the ability to do a controlled burn or, have some funds, to help, on a conservation side, for example, maintain riparian habitat or build water structures that are going to benefit wildlife. Some of those are government funds can be helped used to do that, but they might not be able to do those things if there's endangered species impact. And so and even their livelihood of grazing cattle and things like that, and brush removal. Ocelots need thick brush, which we have here in South Texas, as part of their habitat requirements. But huge expanses of thick brush don't work if you're trying to make a living raising cattle. Mm-hmm. And so if you need to open up some areas, there's some fear amongst landowners that they might not be able to do that if people knew that there were ocelots on their property. So it just gets really kind of takes the goals of the Endangered Species Act and almost flips them around when you get onto private lands and makes it almost a drawback to have an endangered species on your property, even if you're proud to have them. You just lose the kind of the incentives to in that conservation, or at least in letting others know that that you've got this species. So and I think the reason you've have the feeling that it's a tough, tricky, muddy issue is because it is tough, tricky, and muddy. Mm-hmm. And so it's difficult, but it's been exciting to work with some of the Fish and Wildlife Service people who are charged with enforcing the Endangered Species Act and helping them meet their goals of being able to conserve ocelots and help recover them while not endangering, the livelihoods of the private landowners. Yeah. I think there's a sweet spot there that we're trying to hit, and I think it's really possible to do. And so that's what's exciting right now is being able to see the various parties come together and hopefully be able to meet everybody's objectives and in the end, the best way of solving all those problems is to recover ocelots and have them off the endangered species list where they can be roaming free around South Texas and they're not, a controversial species, wolves, that would be a little different conversation, but ocelots aren't, killing livestock and, they're really, would just be a cool thing to have. And so it's I think could just be a wonderful conservation success story if we can get all the players pushing in the same direction, and that's where it seems like we're heading, which is where the excitement comes in.
I love hearing that, and that's one of the whole reasons I wanted to start this podcast a long time ago, is because you read all these crazy articles where people are just trying to get clicks one way or the other, and I feel like those are on the far extremes, maybe like 5% on each side of the spectrum. And right in the middle are all these people that all they want solutions. I mean, everybody's got their, what is important to them. But I mean, I think the work you're doing with private landowners in Texas for this specific species, I mean, it's just a perfect example of how people want to work together. And it's just, I can get so bogged down in all these crazy news articles. So if anything, the whole podcast is to make me feel better about the world. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that. Cause I think like say, there's a lot of people in that boat that would love to see things come together and be able to work. So.
And then I want to hear more about your Grasslands program, because I'm deep in the learning about grass in my day job. So can you discuss that program y'all are doing?
Yeah. And so that's a 20-year-old program, and it started as a program called South Texas Natives. And it started out with some grand goals, but a pretty focused geographic, extent. Just South Texas, basically from San Antonio south, was sort of the original idea. And what its genesis was a lot of these private landowners seeing the wildlife and livestock value of their property declining because of invasive exotic grasses. And there's a variety of sources of some of these grasses, and some of them actually have really positive livestock value. And so some of them were planted intentionally by landowners, but they don't always stay where they were planted. And so that's one source of some of these grasses. But another source has been the Highway Department. The Texas Department of Transportation is mandated with federal regulations to get vegetative cover on any soil that they disturb. And if they don't do it, they can get in big trouble.
Yeah.
Not only the agency getting fined, but potentially people could go to jail if they don't follow these federal regulations. And again, it's a federal regulation I think has value, but some of these unintended consequences. And what this unintended consequence was in South Texas is Texas Department of Transportation would do some work along a highway. They'd have to plant something and get ground cover growing there quickly. And there was no native seed that could do that. And so the only options the Texas Department of Transportation had were some of these exotic plants, these exotic grasses. And these old world blue stems is a class of them that, that's been used widely along roadsides, across a lot of the southern U.S. Well, landowners then would see these old world blue stems and other species, moving into their pastures, and these invasive grasses will form what we call a monoculture. So there's basically nothing growing in an area except that one grass. And if there's one thing we know about biologic systems, diversity is important, and that diversity starts with the vegetation. And if you've only got one plant growing there, now you have very few insects there, which means there's very little, other seed production and food for herbivores, and the whole system can kind of, become very simple and lose, the big value that we have of these diverse wildlife and plant communities.
Yep.
So what got started then is some of these landowners came to the Caesar Kleberg Institute and said, hey, we got a huge problem here. We want to address this. And so how do we go about this? And Fred Bryant, who was the director at the time, said, yeah, no, we get it. From a wildlife and a range resources standpoint, this is a big problem. And so what they built was a program to go out onto private lands across South Texas and collect seed from native plants, and focusing really on grasses originally. So they'd go out and get this grass seed, and they'd record where they collected it, when they collected it, and keep those collections all separate so that there was, they knew what soil types were in that area and everything. And there are other sources of native seeds, but there were none from this region. And so when the Texas Department of Transportation would try planting some of these native seeds from other parts of the country, those seeds just wouldn't do well here. Mm-hmm. They weren't adapted to the soils, to the climate, to the pathogens and the insects, the molds and funguses and whatever else is down here. So these locally adapted native seeds were really the key. And what this program would do, they'd collect all those seeds, they'd bring them here to campus, they would test them to make sure that they had a high enough germination rate to be able to proceed. And then they'd grow them in greenhouses, get them into the fields, and they'd select some that grew well here and that grew in such a way that seed could be harvested commercially. And that's what you really need to do this at a scale that's meaningful. You could do a little acre with, going out and hand collecting seed and sprinkling it out
sure.
on an acre and recover it. But when you're talking about tens or hundreds of miles of highway and pipeline right-of-ways and all kinds of things, that approach isn't going to work. This needs to be on a commercial scale. And then the other big key on this was getting some commercial growers to really take that leap of faith, make the capital investments in land and equipment to say, yeah, I think there is a big enough market out there, for me as a private company to get involved in this. And TxDOT signed up to said, hey, we'll buy seed. Our program and the landowners said, yeah, we'll buy seed. And so there's a couple of companies that said, okay, we'll do this. We're going to get involved. And they made that, that big leap. And it's not just a 1-year commitment. They plant these grasses, and then it's it's 2 or 3 years before they can even start harvesting seed. Mm-hmm. And so it's a big commitment. But they did it. And so all that process played out over about a 10-year period where we got enough seed on the market that the Texas Department of Transportation said, wow, this is working for us. We want to do the same thing in Central Texas. And then we want to do the same thing in West Texas. And now in the Permian Basin and the Panhandle, and most recently East Texas and the coastal prairies, kind of Houston down toward Victoria, all that area. So this program now has gone from South Texas natives 20 years ago, that about 3 years ago completed its statewide impact. And so it's now known as Texas Native Seeds. And we've got six regions around the state with a director in each of those regions that are mimicking or replicating this process of collecting seeds, from that region, and then working with these plant material centers that the USDA has and other partners to grow them up and then to get them to commercial producers who can then make enough of it to do good out in the Permian Basin, and in the Eagle Ford oil play here in South Texas, and for the Texas Department of Transportation, and increasingly for private landowners who said, wow, I got this, old farm field that I want to turn back into wildlife habitat.
Yeah.
Or, I've got this old pasture. It has buffalo grass in it, it's great for cattle in the day, but now our focus has changed and we want it to be good for wildlife. And so those are all the kind of players that are starting to being impacted by this Texas native seeds effort.
That's an amazing project because, as I mentioned, a lot of my work is dealing with irrigated farmland that either has been or will be dried up eventually. And it just creates this complete ecological mess because it's just really hard to get it revegetated properly. And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out. But man, I wish Colorado State would do something similar like that around here, because
so we've had other states come to our program and say, how did you guys do this? And, how can we mimic that in our state? And we're happy. We'd love to share this model out because it has such incredible conservation value. And, I talked about grasses as being a big focus, but now, with monarchs and pollinators, there's a lot of species there that we've started developing and getting into commercial production. And, really, like I said, that diversity is just key. And so all kinds of other forbs and weeds and those kind of plants are going to be an important part of those mixes and the component that's going to help bring, some of these disturbed areas back to a, more balanced, ecologically valuable, spot on the earth.
I seriously, you and I are probably going to need to talk about this on a separate call because I was just out yesterday in Crowley County, Colorado, which is about 95% of the formerly irrigated farmland out there has been dried up, and it's just a massive 100,000 acre weed patch, and nothing good comes from that. So that's inspiring for everybody, but especially for me to hear. So that's excellent. We'll talk more about that. I want to hear more about you, because you obviously are unbelievably passionate about this work. So you grew up here in Colorado, and what's the path that led you to this dream career you have? Yeah,
so in some ways it was really straightforward, and in other ways it was a little convoluted. So the straightforward part is that I never had any doubt what I wanted to do in my life, and a main reason for that is I had a model. A lot of people that get involved in wildlife, they get shunted to animal science programs and, park ranger type programs because no one really knows. A lot of high school counselors don't really know that hey, there's this field of wildlife biology, and you can go out and do this this good work for conservation by working with wildlife. But my grandfather was a wildlife biologist, and so I grew up knowing that, hey, you can get paid to go do this stuff, and you can do a lot of good in the world. And so I knew all along. I never had to hum and haw about what it is that I wanted to go do. And so I grew up in Greeley. Colorado State, has a great wildlife biology program. It was 40 miles kind of northwest of Greeley. So that's where I went for my bachelor's, and had a wonderful experience there. Made a lot of friends and contacts, got all kinds of great experience, all that kind of stuff. And then knew that to do research, because my grandfather had been heavily involved in research too. And that just really appealed to me. So knew that I needed some graduate education. Went up to Washington State University and worked on a project up there with grizzly bears.
Oh, wow.
And the faculty member I worked with had been working with deer and elk and other herbivore type animals for about 20 years and had put together a wonderful career in wildlife nutrition working with those species. And then, I don't know if it was a mid-career crisis or what, but he thought, man, bears, there's all kinds of cool nutrition things to do with bears. So he had just switched over a lot of his research program to bears. And I was the second student that had come on with him when he made the switch to studying bears. And so worked with captive bears, because a lot of this nutrition stuff, it's harder to do with animals that don't want to be around you.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But working with captive animals, you can get estimates of digestibility and a lot of the things that you need to understand, so that how a wild animal is interacting with its environment, and food and nutrition are just critical for bears, because they have to eat basically 12 months worth of food in 6 or 9 months.
Sure.
Because they're hibernating. And so that was a really neat experience, working with them. Had both black and grizzly bears at Washington State University, and they've continued with all kinds of neat work out of that program. And after finishing my master's, my major advisor up there had a former student who was working in Uvalde in Texas.
Okay.
And so I actually spent a year right after my master's working here in Texas with that scientist and doing some work on white-tailed deer and actually some fallow deer too. There was a landowner out by Uvalde who was raising fallow deer for a venison market, and had just got started and wanted to know more about the types of forages that these deer needed, and how to make that whole system work. So that was a project I worked on while I was there for a year in Uvalde. And then I took a PhD position at Virginia Tech University. So
okay. Yeah.
Got into a whole new environment, the eastern deciduous forest, and working with a species of grouse out there called a ruffed grouse.
Yeah. That's a beautiful area through there. I used to drive through there all the time.
Yeah, and we were right near the Appalachian Trail.
Oh yeah,
and, some of that really pretty country. So I spent 4 years in Virginia studying these ruffed grouse, and again, kind of a nutrition focus. And then after finishing up there, took a position, which my wife was really excited about, to load our 18-month-old daughter and me and her into a moving van, and we headed to Humboldt State University in Northern California.
Yeah, yeah.
And I taught there for a year and got to talk to students about managing redwood trees, which there's nowhere else in the country you can learn about redwood trees, especially not in Colorado or eastern side of Washington or Virginia. So I learned a lot there, just maybe one step ahead of the students, but taught there for a year at Humboldt State, and then spent a year at Utah State, kind of another, we call them postdoc type positions, and did research there. I was able to get back into a little ruffed grouse research, and worked with some of the wonderful people there at Utah State University in Logan. And then son was born right before we left Logan, so he was about 3 weeks old when we got down here to Kingsville in 1996, and been here ever since.
Man, you hit you hit like the best spots of the country. Only places like maybe those lakes up in Minnesota and Hawaii, and otherwise
exactly.
You would have
hit
hit everywhere. That's
well, it is, and every one of them, like I say, just a wonderful place to get outside and hike and hunt and fish and backpack and just do all that stuff. So it's just really good. And from a wildlife and conservation standpoint, seeing those different systems and the different way that wildlife's managed, and and the things that wildlife are having to contend with in the environment, that background has been really helpful to me to bring that broader perspective to my teaching and my research.
Yeah, and I would imagine just from kind of a intellectual curiosity standpoint, I mean, you can never figure it all out. It seems like you may be kind of addicted to challenging yourself with these new subjects. That's inspiring to hear.
Yeah, and it keeps you humble too.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You realize how much out there we don't know.
Oh yeah, that was another quote in that video I'll link to that Caesar Kleberg said, is that the more you learn about wildlife, the more you realize you don't know anything, or something along those. And so
there's a lot of experts out there, but a lot of them is because they just don't know all the complexities that are really operating.
Sure. Oh yeah, that's what I say about water rights. I say I know a lot more about water rights than I did, but on a relative basis, I actually know less because I know how much I don't know now.
That's for sure. That's a complex deal.
It's crazy. You're obviously a great teacher and a storyteller, and I imagine teaching is a big part of what you do. I mean, how do you balance that? Because I would imagine you love the research, and you love, in that video, you're out there putting a collar on, I think, ocelot, and so. I mean, I don't want to ask you which one you like the most, but how do you kind of balance that? The I want to do research because I love doing it versus I want to teach these energetic young students how about this stuff.
Well, so the neat thing about our model here at the Caesar Kleberg Institute, and this is true in university programs across the country, really, but we have structured things so that our research and our teaching can actually go hand in hand. So in some ways, we don't have to choose. We do a lot of our research with graduate students, and it's actually, I think, probably the best teaching environment you could have, because it's one-on-one, focusing on a project, sitting down, working out the study designs, and then working in the field. Don't get to do that nearly as much. The graduate students get to do all that fun stuff, but then bringing the data back and working with them on analysis and the whole bit. And so that's one way that that we can keep from having to make that choice.
Mm-hmm.
That having been said, the classroom teaching is a big part of getting the next generation of wildlife biologists trained up. And in my current position now, I don't teach anymore, which was I guess maybe a sacrifice to
Sure.
take this position as director of the institute. But for 20 years, I did teach and enjoyed it tremendously. One way that we balance that is our faculty appointments at the Caesar Kleberg Institute are unique amongst most faculty in the country, in that because of the private funding that we have for the Caesar Kleberg Institute, we really pay about 75% of most of our scientists' salary to do research. And the other 25% comes from the university, and that's where the teaching really comes in. And so our teaching load isn't nearly as heavy as it would be, for other faculty that don't have that kind of an appointment. But I think what it does is it actually gives us more time to focus on those, one or two classes that we're teaching a semester, and than we would if we were trying to teach 3 or 4 classes a semester. So,
Sure.
So that's actually really refreshing, because you can spend the time to, do the background work and do field trips and do the present the material in a way that you really think it needs to be presented, instead of, wow, I got 3 more classes today. We're going to have to do the best we can with this and roll through it. And so our appointments here at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute lend themselves, I think, to really strong research and really strong teaching for that reason. And I think are a really good balance. We can excel at both of those.
Once again, you got the dream job. You got the dream setup. All right. So you're the boss. Where do you see the institute going in the next few years? I mean, it just seems like you're doing so much cutting edge work, and you have been for so long. I mean, what is your vision for the long term? I guess what's the long term vision for the organization?
So really, the kind of next logical step for us has been, but the people that brought us to the dance are South Texas landowners and people that come to South Texas to enjoy wildlife. And so for the longest time, we've been really focused in South Texas, and there's still a lot of work to be done here. And so we'll always have our, kind of our heart in South Texas. But increasingly, because of the quality of our faculty and, and the great network of alum that we have spread across Texas and across the U.S., there's more and more opportunities for our expertise to help answer questions elsewhere in Texas and increasingly elsewhere around the country. So one of the things that's happening is we're getting more and more involved, kind of like our Texas Native Seeds program. I explained it was a South Texas focus, and because of the need, it went statewide. And we're seeing that in some of our other programs, other research programs. We've got a scientist who focuses on migratory birds, waterfowl, wetland birds, and other birds. And, his program obviously isn't focused just here in South Texas because of the nature of the species he's working with. And he increasingly has, collaborative projects across the country and even across the world, because some of the species, are widely distributed, and his expertise is valuable to people in Europe and Asia and all. So that I think is where, some of the next phase is going to be, is to make sure that we're doing right by South Texas, but able to help in conservation efforts elsewhere in the state, and at least at some level outside Texas. The other thing that I see happening is the wildlife research field is evolving rapidly in terms of the technology that's available to support it, and the sophistication of the analyses that are necessary to handle these massive amounts of data that are coming in from satellites and drones and GPS collars and all kinds of things. And so the other thing is that my goal is to make myself obsolete by bringing in this kind of next generation of scientists to help make sure we're on the cutting edge of genetics and disease monitoring and all the kind of things, tools that we need to do the research that's important here.
I love it. That just sounds so exciting, and it's going to be really the work you guys have already done is just amazing on many, many levels. So I'm going to be excited to follow along. I got two final questions for you before we wrap it up. The first one, I know you've edited some books, but I would imagine I'm not smart enough to read those books. But I read a lot, and I'm always looking for good recommendations. Do you have any books that somebody with a much lower intelligence level than you, like me, could read? What books would you recommend about? I mean, it could be the history of Texas, wildlife in Texas, wildlife in general. Are there any good books that you think are kind of must reads for the average person who wants to learn and appreciate wildlife?
God, there's so much good stuff. I enjoy reading, and I'll try to get 5 to 10 pages a night before I fall asleep.
Same.
Make your way through some books on that, and there's so much good stuff out there on conservation and wildlife, et cetera. But you had mentioned somebody ought to write a book on Caesar Kleberg, and somebody did write a book on Caesar
Perfect.
Kleberg. One of the trustees of the Caesar Kleberg Foundation for Wildlife Conservation wrote a book called Caesar Kleberg and the King Ranch. Dwayne Leach is that trustee, and as a trustee, he had just developed a strong passion for Caesar and his conservation legacy, and so this book on Caesar Kleberg and the King Ranch is an excellent one to understand at least the local kind of conservation efforts, and even gets into how some of the politics work in making some of these things happen.
Mm-hmm.
So Dwayne did a great job putting that book together. So that's one that that would be fun. Just trying to think a little more broadly, and like I said, there's just so much good stuff out there that touches on just different aspects of wildlife and conservation. You
ever read American Serengeti by Dan Flores?
I have not.
You'd love it. It's really good. It's more about the kind of northern, but he goes through and he profiles what he calls charismatic megafauna.
Sure.
And he wrote that book about coyotes called Coyote America, which is really interesting. It's crazy, but thanks to this podcast, I've gotten to be friends with him, and he's unbelievably cool guy. And he's a real gift for telling stories about these wildlife in a way that resonates. So not that I'm not trying to butt into your answer, but for people.
Actually, I'm always looking for good reads.
Those are great. I'll put links to
pass books around. So that's super. I appreciate that.
Yeah. He I don't know. I could go on about for days about all those good books. I'm in the same boat. So kind of final question, knowing everything that you've done, and you've seen wildlife in all aspects of in all different areas of the country, you're, obviously committed conservationist. I mean, and the people who listen to this podcast are the same way. They may not work in the conservation field, but they appreciate conservation. They appreciate wide open spaces, the land. I mean, do you have any kind of parting words or maybe even a request you would ask of people that are listening to this, something that they could do in their neck of the woods to kind of help make things a little better?
What I've come to realize, and when I'm out hiking somewhere and there's other people on the trail, there's kind of two responses you can have to that. And one is, dang, I want to get out here and be alone, blah, blah, blah. The response I increasingly have now is like, this is so cool to have all these people
mm-hmm.
out in the world, enjoying nature and however it is, whether you're a trail bike rider or a bird watcher or a hunter or fisher person or, backpacker, whatever, I think the biggest thing, kind of like Edward Abbey said, is just to get out there and enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then you got people that are passionate about it. And that's kind of been the lesson here in South Texas is once you get people that are passionate about it, the support will come, the good stuff will happen. And I think our biggest threat now is to have enough people or to not have enough people that care about the resource and understand the value of some wild lands and some diverse rangelands and big flocks of migrating birds passing overhead, even if they can't see them. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to do. And so, grab a kid, grab a buddy, whatever, and get outside and do stuff. That'd be my recommendation.
I love it. And I agree with it. I mean, I think that is the key. Nobody's going to want to fight for all these places unless they care about them. And the only way you care about them is get out in them. So I think that is timely advice. So, well, Dave, this was great. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to chat. People are going to love this. I really appreciate it. How can people learn more about the Institute? You want to direct them to websites or social media or anything like that?
Yeah. So we've got a website, and then we do have Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, presence. And so, I'd be happy to send you those links if you got a place to post some of them. And we'd enjoy, getting our message out and hearing from people and, anything we can do to help promote wildlife conservation. We're all in.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.